Hi, my name is David Brown, and I want to welcome you all to this online discussion with Jerry Muller and Michael Brenner on behalf of Leo Baeck Institute. Um, the if we'll get into the discussion very quickly, but if you don't know Leo Baeck Institute, if this is your first time with us, we are a library and archive focused on the history and culture of German-speaking Jews, with large library, archival collections, art collections, all based at the Center for Jewish History, where we're a founding partner in Manhattan. And sometimes we also do programs there. So I encourage you to check our website, www.lbi.org, to find out what we have coming up. And what we have today is very exciting, a fascinating biography, and two eminent historians to discuss it. One is the author, Jerry Z. Muller, Professor Emeritus of History at Catholic University of America, and the author of 7 books, including The Mind and the Market and Capitalism and the Jews. His work has appeared in Foreign Affairs, the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, and other leading publications. And today we're here to discuss his newest book, Professor of Apocalypse, The Many Lives of Jakob Taubes, which was published earlier this year by Princeton University Press and will be published by the Zurich Jüdischer Verlag in December. And if you haven't had a chance to read this book yet, we'll be sharing a discount code. You can get 30% off directly from Princeton University Press using a discount code MULL30. We'll post the link and the code in the chat, and we'll also be sending that to you via email. In conversation with Jerry Muller today is Michael Brenner, the Seymour and Lillian Abenson Chair in Israel Studies at American University and the Director of American University's Central for Israel Studies. Since 1997, he's been a professor of Jewish history and culture at the Ludwig Maximilians University of Munich. And among his many academic leadership roles on advisory boards, he is also the international president of the Leo Baeck Institute. There are Leo Baeck Institutes in Jerusalem and in London as well, and Michael Brenner is on the board that coordinates between all of them. He is the author of 9 books. I hope that's still up to date, but in any case, they've been translated into 10 languages and include The Renaissance of Jewish Culture in Weimar, Germany, and most recently, In Hitler's Munich, Jews, Revolution, and the Rise of Nazism, which was the topic of a similar discussion that we hosted a few months ago. That discussion and this one today will be on our YouTube channel. So I encourage you to, if you find today's event interesting, share the video with friends. We'll be sending that to you in an email afterwards. And before I hand it over to Michael, there's just one other acknowledgement I'd like to make. I want to thank the Center for Jewish Studies and Israel Studies at Columbia University and Rebecca Coburn for their co-sponsorship of this event. And with that, I'll turn it over to you, Michael, and I think you'll give us an introduction to the topic, and then we'll hear from Jerry about Jakob Taubes.
Thank you so much, David, for the introduction. Welcome, everyone, to this conversation. We're here to discuss a biography today, and I should say right away, after reading it, this is not just another biography. In many ways, the life of Jakob Taubes was it was not such a long life, larger than life. According to almost all of the I think more than 100, almost 200 people interviewed for this biography by Jerry Muller, Taubes was characterized as genial and as demonic, as a brilliant thinker and as an intellectual charlatan. While he had both followers and, I would say, in greater number, enemies, one thing was clear: he did not leave anyone who met him indifferent. As Jerry Muller writes in this amazing biography, he was interested in being interesting. And there was no doubt that he succeeded in this mission. Taubes only published one book during his lifetime, his dissertation of 1947, but probably no other 20th century thinker was able to feel at home simultaneously in as many intellectual and religious environments as Taubes did. Name me one other person who moved with ease between Hasidic circles in Jerusalem, Catholic clerics, communist students, former Nazis, conservative ideologues, and basically all leading intellectuals of his time. He felt close at times, even though this closeness ended in bitter enmity sometimes, with the Satmar Rebbe and with Cardinal Lustiger, with Gershom Scholem and Carl Schmitt, with Susan Sontag and Irving Kristol, with Leo Strauss and Jacques Derrida, with Jürgen Habermas and Herbert Marcuse. His first wife's incriminatory novel, Divorcing, based more than loosely on their marriage, was published shortly before she drowned herself. Gershom Scholem held Taubes also responsible for the suicide of his favorite disciple, Joseph Weiss, and made it very clear to Taubes, whom he had once deemed a promising student, that he never wanted to see him again. And he made sure that that would actually be the case. Maybe Theodor Adorno's characterization of Taubes grasped his character best. I tend to think that Taubes is a person of good intellectual but bad empirical character, that there is part of him that really wants to do the right thing, but that some hard-to-control impulses get in the way. So, to discuss this person today is the author of this biography, Jerry Muller, who reconstructed this incredible life on the basis of meticulous archival research in several countries, many archives, and many personal interviews. So Jerry, please tell us, who was this person? I just got some very broad strikes here. Who was this person, Jakob Taubes, and why did you spend almost 20 years, I believe, of your life writing this book?
Thank you. Thank you for that introduction, Michael. So let me say a little bit about how I came to write the book, and then I'll talk about who Jakob Taubes was. When I was working on my first doctoral dissertation was going to be on an international organization of liberal anti-communist intellectuals called the Congress for Cultural Freedom, that included people in the United States like Daniel Bell and Irving Kristol and his wife Gertrude Himmelfarb and Nathan Glaser and a number of others. And in Europe, it included people like Richard Löwenthal in Germany and Isaiah Berlin in England and so on. And while I ended up not writing that dissertation for various reasons, but while I was working on it in 1980, I was visiting in Jerusalem with my brother-in-law who had studied with Jakob Taubes in Berlin. And it was one of the holidays. And my brother-in-law went to the Western Wall, the Kotel, and brought home Jakob Taubes. And I was assigned to talk to him. So I did, and I said, Professor Taubes, I read somewhere, and I wonder whether you remember that after the war, when you were at the Jewish Theological Seminary, you held a seminar on Maimonides with Irving Kristol and Gertrude Himmelfarb and Daniel Bell and Nathan Glaser. And he proceeded to remember and recount some elements of it. And then I didn't think about Jakob Taubes for a number of years. I wrote a dissertation, first book having to do with German radical right-wing intellectuals and why some of them were attracted to National Socialism and why they became disillusioned with it. And as I was finishing that, I read a little book that came out in late 1987 with the name Jakob Taubes as the author, called Ad Carl Schmitt, which was about the relationship of this Jewish left-wing intellectual to Carl Schmitt, famous political and legal philosopher, critic of liberal democracy during the Weimar Republic from the right, who later in 1933 had thrown in his lot with National Socialism. It was a curious little volume and I didn't quite know what to make of it. And then I didn't think about Jakob Taubes for another couple of decades, for at least 15 years. And I wrote some more books. And then I was starting to get more interested in the relationship between the critique of religion and biblical criticism and historical understandings of religion on the one hand, and political thought in modern Europe, which touched upon the issue of what had come to be sometimes called political theology. And in working on that, I read some more of Leo Strauss. And then in very late 2003, I was at a lecture, public lecture on Leo Strauss, where the lecturer mentioned his famous book on Maimonides called Persecution and the Art of Writing, which is about Strauss's conception of how intellectuals would sometimes hide their actual views because of either political oppression or because they had views that were highly unorthodox in their societies and were subject to persecution. And in the audience were Irving Kristol and Gertrude Himmelfarb, who by then were well into their 70s. And I went up to them afterwards and I said, I knew them a bit already. And I said, do you remember this seminar that you did with Jakob Taubes about Maimonides? And Irving Kristol, who had known most of the major intellectuals of the 20th century, his eyes lit up and he said, remember, he was unforgettable. He was the only really charismatic intellectual I've ever known. And he started to tell me some things, that Taubes had rabbinic ordination and so on, and how brilliant he was. And he said, someone should write something about him. And his wife, Gertrude Himmelfarb, said, yeah, maybe it should be you, Jerry. So I thought about it a bit. I did some more reading about Taubes. There wasn't that much available, but I noticed that one time or another, he had been in contact with a remarkable range of 20th century intellectuals in German-speaking Europe, in Israel, in the United States, and beyond. So I started out with this sort of a puzzle and a challenge. The puzzle was, what did it mean to be a charismatic intellectual? And why were so many people interested in this fellow? And it became clear to me that I could use his biography to explore and reconstruct a wide range of cultural and political and religious contexts in 20th century Europe and the United States and Israel, and also institutional contexts, how universities worked, how publishers worked, how ideas get spread, and so on. And so I undertook this project, and we can talk more later about how I did it, but I suppose I should give listeners a brief overview of his life. So he had a lot of what's called yichus, that is distinguished Jewish lineage. He was born in 1923 in Vienna. His family on both sides had recently migrated from Galicia. On one side, they were distinguished Talmudic scholars, and on the other side, they were distinguished. They were descendants of one of the minor Hasidic dynasties, the Zhidachov dynasty. Taubes's father was a modern Orthodox rabbi and scholar, Zvi Taubes, who was versed in Western scholarship as well as in traditional Jewish sources. In 1936, so just after Jakob Taubes's bar mitzvah, the family moved to Zurich, where his father became the rabbi of the largest congregation there, having already been the rabbi, I should say, of one of the most important congregations in interwar Vienna. And it was there that Jacob Taubes came of age during the Shoah, really. And during the Second World War, he studied at the University of Zurich, where he studied sociology and philosophy and history. For a while, he studied also at what I think was by then the only remaining traditional yeshiva in Europe, because the rest of them had been destroyed by the Nazis. This was in Montreux. And shortly after the war, he got his rabbinic ordination as an Orthodox rabbi. He was influenced, his father's activism and some of his own during the Second World War was focused on trying to mobilize Protestant and Catholic clergy to make more people aware of the murder of the Jews that was going on in Eastern Europe in general, and then in Hungary in particular. And that brought this young Jacob Taubes into contact with a lot of the leading Protestant and Catholic theologians in Switzerland. And he was influenced as a young man by people like Karl Barth, leading Protestant theologian, but he was also influenced by Marxists like Georg Lukács, by a variety of rabbinic figures. When he applied to go to the Jewish Theological Seminary in 1947, he had letters from Leo Baeck, the most famous liberal Jewish theologian in Europe at the time, and from Yechiel Weinberg, the most distinguished remaining Orthodox rabbi in Europe at the time. And he was fascinated by Carl Schmitt, who had written about political theology, about what were the possible links between political positions and theological positions. And he was fascinated in general by Gnosticism and antinomianism. And that was the subject of his doctoral dissertation and his first book, his only book really, called Western Eschatology, or Abendländische Eschatologie. And that dealt with a lot of things, but it dealt above all with the history of religious movements in Judaism and above all in Christianity that seized on religious themes about either the evils of the contemporary world, that was the Gnostic part, or the possibilities of radical transformation, that was the apocalyptic part, and combined them into various kinds of egalitarian revolts. And he traced this briefly through the history of Christianity, some references to Judaism, and then he was interested in the secularization of these ideas in German idealism and in Hegel and Marx, which he took over largely from another scholar, Karl Löwit. And then he was looking for a job, and for various reasons, it was impossible for him to do so in Switzerland. He expressed no desire to go to Germany, although he was deeply immersed in German culture and German intellectual life, but he saw himself as sort of torn between his German cultural side and his Jewish side. He ended up going to the Jewish Theological Seminary for 2 years, where he was assigned to study Talmud with Saul Lieberman, the greatest Talmudist probably of his day, and the seminary paid for him to study philosophy with Leo Strauss, who exposed him to this conception of the history of philosophy as marked by Aesopian writing, or writing between the lines. And while he was studying with Strauss, he held this seminar of a number of up-and-coming young intellectuals, mostly from a leftist background, who were starting to get interested in matters Jewish. And they did this seminar on Maimonides with Taubes. And that included, as I say, Daniel Bell and Nathan Glazer and Irving Kristol and Gertrude Himmelfarb, and the younger person, Arthur A. Cohen, and Ruth Glazer, she was then, later Ruth Gay. And the seminary decided that, on the one hand, he was brilliant and too talented to waste, but that they didn't have room on their faculty for someone who did the kind of stuff that he was doing. So they paid for him to go and study and work at Hebrew University, where he studied above all with Gershom Scholem, whose work on the history of Messianism and antinomianism had deeply influenced him. He spent a couple of years in Jerusalem, where he had contact with all the German Jewish intelligentsia, Martin Buber, Gershom Scholem, Ernst Simon, Hugo Bergmann, Shai Agnon, and many others. And at Hebrew University, he lectured. He was a very popular lecturer, lectured to a younger generation of up-and-coming intellectuals. But in the meantime, before he left New York, he had married a woman by the name of Susan Feldman, who came from a distinguished Hungarian rabbinic family, but whose family by then was alienated from matters Jewish. They had an intellectually intense but somewhat stormy marriage. She didn't want to stay in Jerusalem. He had a falling out, Jakob Taubes had a falling out that Michael already alluded to with Gershom Scholem, and although Hebrew University offered to keep him on for a while, and he might have gotten a tenured position there, he decided to leave, largely because of his wife, who was antipathetic to both Judaism and nationalism in her orientation. After spending a year in Rochester, he spent 2 years as a visiting professor at Harvard. And there was a close friend, and there he was again a very popular lecturer, giving courses on the history of heresy. And there was a close friendship between Jacob and Susan Taubes and another young couple, Philip Reif and his then wife, Susan Sontag, and a close friend of theirs, Herbert Marcuse. Then after spending a year at Princeton, he went on to a tenured position at Columbia University, where he was involved in what was then the early development of the scholarly study of religion as a sort of neutral discipline. Taught a lot of up-and-coming scholars there, was involved as a kind of intellectual impresario, bringing people together from a wide variety of disciplines and orientations. He was unsatisfied with living on the Upper West Side, was more comfortable in German culture, and took a position eventually at the Free University in Berlin, where they offered him a position in the field of Judaica, Judaistic, where he was the head of the first program in Judaistic, or Institute for Judaistic in post-war Germany. But he also wanted another position, which he got, and that was the head of another institute for hermeneutics, which allowed him to study and teach a wide variety of courses. Again, he was a kind of intellectual impresario, bringing people together from differing disciplines and differing political orientations. And then from about 67 on, he became a leading advisor, you might say, and advocate of the German New Left at the university, and was very involved with the radicalization of the university. Eventually, he became disillusioned with that. In the meantime, he had married another woman, Margarita von Brentano, who had a distinguished lineage of a different sort. She was the descendant of a long line of poets and philosophers. She was more radical than he was. They had ever greater conflicts about family matters and political matters. Jacob Taubes had what was known as type 2 manic depression, under which people have some degree of mania, a minor degree of mania for many years, but then when some crisis hits them in middle age, they have a major psychic crisis. And that's what happened to him. He had a major psychic crisis. He was brought to the United States, treated with electroshock therapy. And from then on, he was a kind of wandering Jew, wandering between Germany, where he was very active intellectually, and Jerusalem and Paris. And finally, in 1987, he passed away. Before he did so, he offered a series of lectures called The Political Theology of Paul, which were published posthumously by a couple with whom he developed an intense relationship, Elida and Jan Assmann. And those lectures eventually kind of made a name for him, as certain themes in it about Paul as a radical were picked up by post-communist radical intellectuals like Alain Badiou in France, or Giorgio Agamben in Italy, or Zizek all over. And so he developed this remarkable posthumous reputation that one never would have expected from someone who hadn't published a book since 1947. That's it in a nutshell.
Yes, thank you. I mean, it's not easy to sum up such a life, or as you say in the subtitle, the lives. I would also like to ask the audience to put your questions in the Q&A function, and in a little bit, after I ask a few more questions, I'll call on you as well. So of course, I mean, I must say this is not a book easy to write, I realize by reading it. I understand why it took quite a few years to write it. You have to be really well versed in so many different areas, languages, and you did just a splendid job in telling us those many lives of Jacob Taubes. We can't go into every aspect, of course, in detail, but maybe we'll talk a little bit more about the stay in Israel, in Jerusalem, in the late 40s. And that, of course, brought him in contact with Gershom Scholem, but also brought a very well-known clash between the two.
Yes. So one of the things that I ultimately discovered about Jacob Taubes, and by the way, I didn't know any of this at the beginning when I embarked on this endeavor, was that unlike many people, I mean, some people move from kind of one religious or ideological or political position to another in the course of their lifetimes, right? That's not so unusual. What was unusual about Jacob Taubes is that he managed to retain very differing radical positions in his own life and activity throughout his life. So he could be both. So on the one hand, he was brought up in a Mizrahi family, a Zionist modern Orthodox family. He understood the political logic of Zionism, you might say, and was somewhat sympathetic to it. Indeed, he wanted to move to Israel. And he was, by virtue of his family background, he was deeply versed in Hebrew. So when he got to Jerusalem in 1949, he was lecturing in Hebrew. And apparently his Hebrew was really very beautiful. But while he was there, on the one hand, he had also been attracted to ultra-Orthodox anti-Zionism, because he had accompanied the Satmar Rebbe in Switzerland at the end of the war, and he had also been exposed to other ultra-Orthodox thinkers. And there was a part of him that was sympathetic to that. There was a part of him that, like many Jewish intellectuals, thought of Judaism as too particular or particularistic, and was attracted in theory to more universalist ideologies like Marxism. And in Jerusalem, he was in contact with all those sorts of people. There were young Marxists who were studying at the university, coming out of the kibbutz movement. He had contact with Geula Cohen, who had been the voice of the Etzel during the war, so of the revisionist Zionists. He was in contact with the German Jewish intellectuals like Buber and Bergman and so on, and Scholem. And he moved between these groups and these predilections, as well as his wife's radical criticism of any kind of belonging to any kind of tradition or collective group. So the person who we most wanted to work with was Gershom Scholem, and Scholem regarded him, who had met him already at the Jewish Theological Seminary, regarded Taubes as really very talented and quite brilliant, and was eager to work with him. In time, a couple of things happened. Scholem concluded that Taubes didn't have what Scholem called the Sitzleder or Sitzfleisch, that is the ability to just sit down and work, that would lead to real scholarship. And he thought Taubes was too given to playing with a wide variety of ideas in a non-scholarly way. But more importantly, there was a close relationship between Jakob Taubes and Josef Weiss, who was really Scholem's leading student at the time, a student of Nachman of Bratslav and early Chassidut, and also between Jakob Taubes and Josef Weiss's wife, with whom Taubes had an affair, as Taubes did frequently with women in his environ, including the spouses of his friends and colleagues. Josef Weiss had emotional problems, left Jerusalem with his wife suddenly for a position in Leeds, England, a very minor position, surprising Scholem. There was a correspondence in which Taubes seems to have told Weiss that Scholem had told Taubes in confidence that he thought there was evidence of mental disturbance in one of the late chapters of the dissertation that Weiss was writing for Scholem, and that he ought not, that Scholem was sort of on the warpath, and that Weiss ought not to have contact with him for a while. That word of that eventually got back to Scholem through an interesting string of people, and when Scholem found out, he decided that this was a betrayal of trust, and he wanted to break off contact with Jakob Taubes. Taubes was visiting his in-laws in Rochester, New York at the time, and Taubes did return to Jerusalem and taught there for another year, but Scholem didn't want to have him around anymore. Although other distinguished people there, like Hugo Bergmann, did want to keep him around. So, and thereafter, the relationship between Scholem and Taubes really haunted each of them throughout their lives. It was remarkable how much energy Scholem put into denouncing Taubes, and Taubes in turn developed critiques of Scholem's work, of his work on Messianism and on Walter Benjamin and other subjects. So that's a kind of ongoing sub-theme in the book.
It seems that they both spent a lot of energy, Scholem in making sure he would never meet him again, and Taubes trying to actually reconciliate with Scholem. And when he once appeared, as you describe it, in one apartment where Scholem was invited, Scholem hid in the bathroom until Taubes had left. So it was pretty dramatic over decades, and they, of course, never made up again. I think we have to touch a little bit also on what you already mentioned, his relations with with his first wife, the second wife, but many other women he had. We can't do this here in the time we have, but maybe we should talk a little bit about his first wife, Susan, and also the book she wrote, the novel, which was based certainly more than loosely on her own marriage with Taubes, called Divorcing.
So Susan Taubes was born Susan Feldman from, as I say, this distinguished line of Hungarian rabbis. Her father, though, had broken with Judaism and become a very orthodox Freudian psychoanalyst. In the late 30s, he together with his only daughter, Susan, moved to the United States. And he had already become divorced from his wife. Susan Taubes studied at Bryn Mawr. She was quite brilliant. She was quite beautiful, and early in 1949, she she met Jacob Taubes, who within a matter of months convinced her to marry him. They had as I say, an intellectually intense and at first erotically intense marriage, but they were of different ideological predilections and also personal predilections. So, Gershom Scholem wrote about antinomianism and eroticism and violation of erotic norms by people like Jakob Frank. But for Jacob Taubes, this wasn't just a matter of theory, it was also a matter of practice. And so his propensity to challenge norms and rules and so on was part of his intellectual armature, so to speak, but was also part of the way in which he conducted his life, including by having many affairs with often very intense ones with women. One of the most interesting ones, by the way, I came across because of the Leo Baeck Institute in New York. Brief detour, because it's true. One of his intense relationships just before he met Susan Taubes was with a woman by the name of Gerda Seligson, who was a German Jewish emigre. She was a widow, and she and Jacob had an intense affair while he was at the Jewish Theological Seminary, and their letters were preserved by her till the end of her days and then donated to the collections of the Leo Baeck Institute in New York, which is where I read them. Anyway, back to Susan Taubes. They had a stormy marriage, and by about 1961, when Jacob started to go to the Free University in Berlin, the marriage was already on the rocks. They ultimately got divorced in 1967, and she had written a number of books that had one novel and a number of stories. The novel hadn't been published. And then she wrote this highly autobiographical novel called Divorcing that was partly about her marriage to Jacob Taubes and her attempt to sort of get beyond her unsuccessful attempt in some ways to get beyond his shadow. And it included many scurrilous incidents about Jacob Taubes, many of which were indeed true, but often explored in a somewhat surrealistic and sometimes humorous way. And she had long had depression and suicidal tendencies, and not long after the book was published, as you say, she committed suicide by taking barbiturates and walking into the Atlantic Ocean, and her body was identified by her close friend, Susan Sontag.
Yeah, I mean, the book is full of stories of betrayal, of disappointments. He seemed to, I don't know, do you think he needed it? He had some pleasure in betraying people? I mean, it seems to be from his early days until almost, he seemed to become a little bit different his last years after he became sick. But what's your take on that?
Michael, in his relationships with women, they often were perceived by the women as highly enlivening. And they were, sometimes because they engaged in erotic practices that were new to those women, and it was kind of liberatory for them. He particularly liked to have relationships with women who were from strong religious backgrounds and were earnest, and this was a kind of redemption through sin, you might say, to take a phrase from Scholem, but one that Taubes took seriously. But he also had intense intellectual relationships, usually with these women, and mentored them and exchanged ideas with them, often fostered their career, and that included among those relationships were with Susan Taubes, his first wife, Margarita von Brentano, his second wife, but also people like Ingeborg Bachmann, the great German language poet. So often those relations ended amicably and they remained friends after the relationship was over. Sometimes they ended tragically for these women. And throughout his life, in his relations with both men and women, Taubes tried to be and was successful in being very attractive, above all because of the quality of his mind and personality. But he did have this propensity to betray people when he thought it was convenient for him. And so, that's not true of all of his relations, or even most of them, but it is indeed a recurrent phenomenon in his lifetime.
Let's talk a little bit about his scholarship. And maybe you can explain to us how a student, first of all, he had a smicha. He was the son of the chief rabbi of Zurich. He grew up in an Orthodox home, and he kept some very unorthodox way of orthodoxy throughout his life, at the same time eating pork and also wearing a talit katan sometimes in his last years on the outside over his shirt, and keeping close contacts to very radical anti-Zionist Hasidic circles among the Haredi community in Jerusalem. But he became really very interested in early Christianity, and especially in Paul. And I would like to hear a little bit more about this, as you describe in your book.
Okay, so let me start with the Leo Baeck Institute in New York again, and then work backwards a little bit and forwards a little bit. When I was doing research there, I came across a file that said Tzvi Taubes, which is the name of Jakob Taubes's father. And it had the full text of a long sermon that his father, Tzvi Taubes, gave in 1940, at a time when more and more parts of Europe were falling under Nazi control, about the need for a religious revival in Europe. And Tzvi used as his model Paul, the Apostle Paul, who he said took elements of Judaism and used them to create religious renewal beyond Judaism. And he said, we need something like this again. So first of all, how did Tzvi Taubes come to write such a thing? Well, Tzvi Taubes was educated at the Jewish Theological Seminary in Vienna, in the University of Vienna. And as I discuss at some length in my book, the kind of scholarship that was going on there at the Jewish Theological Seminary, which was based on Wissenschaft des Judentums, that is the modern scholarly study of Judaism, one of the areas of focus was actually on that era of transition between Judaism and Christianity. And Tzvi Taubes actually did his doctoral dissertation, which I was able to read, on Jesus and the Halakha. So the father had a long-standing interest in this. And then, as I say, during the Second World War, Jacob was exposed to many of these leading Protestant and Catholic theologians in Switzerland and abroad. And curiously, from very early on, from about the age of 17, Yaakov, developed this close personal identification with the Apostle Paul. In some ways, it was because Paul seemed to have taken a Jewish tradition and made it accessible to a larger audience. That was one of the ways in which Jakob Taubes thought about himself. There were also elements of Paul's psychology that Taubes found very congenial, including the notion that we can't really control our own urges and emotions except for God's grace. That actually corresponded to Jakob Taubes's psychology as well. And so for the rest of his life, really, Taubes had this ongoing interest in Paul and the biblical and the historical scholarship on Paul. But he developed his own interpretation of Paul, especially in these final lectures, the political theology of Paul, that presented a what you might call a one-sided view of Paul, a view of Paul that in some ways retrojected Jacob Taubes's own propensities back into Paul, where he emphasized Paul's antinomianism and Gnosticism. That is, the extent to which Paul saw the contemporary world as evil and saw that this event, that is to say, the crucifixion of Jesus, created a whole new situation in which one could break not only with Jewish law, the halakha, that's pretty clear in Paul on the face of it, on the pshat, as it were. But Taubes's emphasis in these late lectures was on the fact that Paul challenged the legitimacy of the Roman Empire, in other words, of political law, of the state. So he made Paul out to be a kind of proto-revolutionary, proto-anarchist, you might say. And that interpretation, that does capture something of Paul, but there are also statements of Paul that go in the opposite direction about obeying constituted authority and so on. Taubes tended to ignore those passages. And what's fascinating is that this series of lectures, which was transcribed by Aleida Assmann and published by herself and her husband Jan, that notion of Paul as the arch rebel in Western history and the arch challenger of political authority was picked up by a number of subsequent intellectuals. I'll come to that in a moment, but I should mention one of the curious things about Taubes's interpretation of Paul was that Taubes didn't take seriously for a moment the theological basis on which Paul based his own message about breaking with the law and so on, namely that Jesus was the Messiah and the incarnation and atonement and justification. All of those Pauline themes were themes that Taubes simply left out and created this image of Paul as an arch rebel. And that was later picked up after the fall of communism and sort of disillusionment with Marxism by, on the one hand, a bunch of leftist intellectuals who I mentioned already, and also by post-colonial studies, which saw Paul, thanks to Taubes's interpretation, interpreted Paul as a major challenger to the Roman Empire, and hence a precursor of post-colonial sentiments.
Yeah, and it seems to me that he also generally enjoyed to be a provocateur, to provoke, sometimes in humorous ways. I mean, I remember one example you give is when he was a professor in Berlin and they were looking for a professor in philosophy, and he suggested a Professor Wojtyla from the University of Krakow, which the department seemed not to be aware of who that actually was, and voted in favor. And then after they went through the process, he said, well, he also happens to be Pope John Paul II, so he probably won't come. I also remember, actually, I had one encounter with Taubes myself as a young student in Heidelberg. I attended the Shabbat services, and in walks a man in this black hat, very long, broad coat around himself, and quite an Erscheinung, you would say in German, quite an appearance, with a young German woman. Now I realize it must have been Aleida Assmann. And I asked my neighbor and said, who is this? And they said, Taubes. And I only later really understood who it was. But when I saw the illustrations in your book, I realized wearing the talit katan outside. I mean, it was a certain provocation at the same time when he also, of course, was certainly not a member of any organized Jewish community or went to services regularly. And maybe we can, before I open it to the audience, and there are also already questions in, maybe the last few remarks before we open it up, really on the last years of his life, which were spent, where he kind of reconciled in a way with Berlin again after he was off or was gone, and because of also his health issues, and then returned, and then also in Heidelberg.
Yes. So after he had this psychic breakdown and was treated in New York and came back to Berlin, well, in the interim, his control of the Judaica Institute was taken away from him while he had been away, because he had been really incapable of managing it. And his program in his Institute for Hermeneutic was more or less in the process. They were thinking of closing it down. And Taubes launched a kind of counteroffensive. I should say, in the meantime, between the time that Taubes had been instrumental in the radicalization at the Freie Universität, at the Free University, for a while he was the head of this new division of the university called Fachbereich 11, which was intended to go beyond the bourgeois division of disciplines, and had at first a Marxist orientation, but then as the students became ever more radical and ever more powerful in the university, because under a German university at the time, they were given an increasing vote in how appointments were made. That division of the university, which included philosophy, became ever more not just Marxist but Leninist in its orientation. And Taubes came to believe that it was going to, that division and the university as a whole was going down the tubes in terms of its scholarly standards. And so he launched a campaign together with the Berlin Minister of Education, the Wissenschaftssenator, as it was called in Berlin, a man by the name of Peter Glotz, and the two of them conspired with the leading journalist in Berlin who covered university matters for the Tageszeitung and for the Tagesspiegel, sorry. And together they engineered the closing down of this faculty and a set of new appointments of distinguished but not radical philosophers. So Taubes had a role there in Berlin. At the same time, he was spending several months a year in Jerusalem, where he had contact with a younger generation of Israeli intellectuals, people like Avishai and Edna Margalit and Moshe Hidel and Guy Strumza and his wife Sarah, and Moshe Halbertal and others. Sometimes he was with them, sometimes he was with this radical Hasidic group, Toldot Aharon. Sometimes he was lecturing to monks at the École Biblique. So he spent some time there. He spent some time each year in France, where he was also in contact with, living part of the time in a monastery and part of the time with intellectuals like Louis Althusser and so on. And he was fascinated, as you alluded to earlier, by Cardinal Lustiger, who had made the voyage, as it were, or crossed the bridge from Judaism to Catholicism, something that for Taubes was a kind of example of the path not taken, but that he found as a fascinating phenomenon. And then in his final years in Berlin, how to put this, he fell in love with Aleida Assmann, who was a young scholar of literature, who was the married wife of a distinguished Egyptologist, Jan Assmann. Together, as he was ailing in his final years, they brought him to Heidelberg, which is where you met him in shul. And one of the things he would do, as you say, is bring Aleida and some of her children to synagogue with him. And they developed a very close relationship. And these lectures that he gave on the political theology of Paul were given in Heidelberg a couple of months before he died, when he was already almost on his deathbed. And then it was transcribed by Aleida Assmann, and then she and her husband wrote an introduction to it. which gave it a certain interpretive spin about political theology. And they really set the stage for his posthumous reputation, both by publishing that book and a collection of his essays and so on.
Thank you, Jerry. Let's take a few questions, and actually I'll start reading a comment. So there are quite a few colleagues here as well, and some who knew him. Sandra Gilman, unfortunately we can't put the voices on, so I have to read it. Would be much better if Sandra could read it. Sandra Gilman says, as one who studied with Taubes in the late 60s, one needs to add that his seminars on hermeneutics paralleled other younger professors of the day, such as my teachers Lemmert and Sondi, who demanded a rethinking of the very structure of the role of interpretation in the function of a newly reformed university. He was not alone. I don't know if you want to comment or if we should just leave it.
No, I should say that I do discuss in the book his relationship with those people, especially with Peter Sondi, who was still a young literary scholar at the time, much influenced by Marxism, and Sondi became the founder and head of Institute for Comparative Literary Studies, and he and Taubes often cooperated, holding joint seminars and bringing in joint speakers and so on. And Sondi also was one of these people who was a supporter of the New Left at the Freie Universität, but then he became disillusioned with it before Taubes did. He was also depressive, and as a young man took his own life.
But in this case, we cannot blame Taubes as much.
No, not at all, not at all.
My colleague Philip Lennart from Berkeley says, I had the impression from reading Taubes' Abendländische Eschatologie that his initial position on Paul was far more critical than in his lectures from 1987. Would you agree? Would you see Taubes as a Paulinian or an anti-Paulinian?
The question makes a good point, and that is his position on Paul, or rather his emphases of what he thought significant about Paul, changed over time. And in Occidental Eschatology, his doctoral dissertation, he does emphasize that Paul was influenced by Gnostic conceptions of the world as an evil place and so on. But he does there mention Paul's political quietism. And in that sense, he was critical of him. And there it's Jesus who's really the turning point, as it were. And then over time, Taubes changed his emphasis of what he wanted to, how he wanted to interpret Paul, or what he wanted to see as most significant in him.
So this is actually very nice from Joshua Taubes, who is the grandson of Jacob Taubes, identifying himself. Thank you for joining us, Joshua. I am curious, he writes, why write about Jacob? There are so many fascinating philosophers to write about. Why him?
So there are a few reasons. First of all, because he was a colorful personality, a charismatic personality, an attractive personality, a brilliant personality, a person about whom, as we've already indicated, there were radically different opinions from people who saw him as brilliant and others who saw him as a charlatan, from people who saw him as inspiring and loved him, and others who saw him as demonic, a term that often came up in the interviews that I did. Also because he was involved and intellectually interested in a set of questions that interested me and that I wanted to explore in their 20th century setting, about the relationship between religion and politics, about the tensions between someone who has a scholarly historical understanding of their religion versus religious faith and religious commitment. And that was another one of these areas where Taubes had a foot, as it were, in each camp. That is, he was well versed and would write about historicist approaches to the study of Judaism. He thought, for example, that that rabbinic Judaism was a creation of the rabbis, of the Pharisees and after the destruction of the Second Temple, as opposed to the Orthodox view that the ideas and the laws in the Talmud go back to Sinai. On the other hand, he could pray in an Orthodox synagogue with great fervor and with tears and so on. I don't know what he was doing in Heidelberg the Shabbat you saw him. So Joshua, the answer is he was a fascinating figure as a person, and he allowed me to use his biography to explore these larger issues in these larger religious and political cultural contexts in German-speaking Europe, the United States, and Israel. That's why it's such a big book, by the way.
And as a reader, I would like to add, I cannot even imagine who else would give these glimpses into these very different worlds, even within Israel. I mean, he walks from the seminar of the Hebrew University right into the Hasidic anti-Zionist sect, which is pretty extreme. He walks with ease in all those different circles in Berlin, in New York, in Paris, and there is something quite unique about this verse. At the same time, he also didn't publish much. He was really somebody who I think influenced people through, as you say, his charismatic personality and certainly his brilliance of thought as well. Although you also write, he at some point, you say, he had something to say about everything. It wasn't always very as profound as it seemed. I have maybe relating to this question by someone who wrote another intellectual biography of Elias Bickerman, sure. I was impressed by the gap between the oral autobiography perpetrated by the subject and the story told by the documents. I guess that relates to Bickerman. Did you find an analogous gap? And that is, I think, a good question, because you have, I mean, I don't think I recall any biography where you almost interviewed 200 people for your book.
Yeah, so the book is based partly on reading. So Taubes, as you say, didn't publish much for someone who had a prominent position at some of the leading universities of the Western world, but he did actually write a lot, but it was in the form of letters, and his letters would typically combine intellectual and religious and spiritual matters with personal matters and institutional matters about fights going on at the Hebrew University or at the Free University and so on. So I had hundreds of letters from Taubes, some of which were in an archive in Berlin, some of his early letters I got from his children, Ethan and Tanya. And some of them were in repositories around the world. But it quickly became clear to me, after I decided I was going to try to do such a study, that much of his influence was through his person, and that therefore I had to interview people who knew him. And I interviewed well over 100 people who knew him from the time of his bar mitzvah in Vienna in 1936. I interviewed a couple of his female cousins who were then alive and living in Israel, through his deathbed in 1987. And I wouldn't say, in contrast to the question, I wouldn't say that there was a radical disjunction between what one found in letters and what one found in these personal interviews. Now, different people had very different views of Taubes, both in their letters and in the interviews that I did with him. Taubes was also a person about whom stories were told. He was kind of a legendary figure. You sort of alluded to that in terms of how people responded when you saw him in a synagogue in Heidelberg. And some of those stories were true, and some of them were exaggerations. But that's part of the story too of Taubes, is the stories that were told about him.
Yes, I'll take two questions together. Michael Meyer, former international president of Leo Baeck Institute, asks, was there a relationship with his relative Uriel Tal, who of course was a professor of history in Israel? And then David Goldstein asks, what kind of relationship did Taubes have with Abraham Yeshua Heschel at JTS?
Okay, Michael Meyer, there was a relationship with Uriel Tal. Uriel Tal was those of us who work on German Jewish history, of course, or German intellectual history, know him very well as a historian of the relationship between Jews and Christianity in the late Kaiserreich and beyond. He was a professor in Israel, and Tal, the name Tal, was a Hebraicization of Taubes. So they were cousins. They knew each other, but it's unclear to me what sort of relationship they had, how close it was, or how important it was. I was told that Uriel Tal used to kid Jakob Taubes that he wasn't a real Taubes, because actually Taubes's father's name was Edelstein. So his grandfather's name was Edelstein, and his grandmother's name was Taubes. In Galicia in those years, Jews often didn't register their marriages civilly because it was expensive and so on. And so the children sometimes had the last name of their mother. So Uriel Tal used to kid Jakob Taubes about that. But I don't know much more than that. The other question was about, his relationship to Heschel. Unclear. Taubes, they talked. When the head of the seminary, Finkelstein, brought Taubes to the seminary in 1947, he seems to have hoped that Taubes would be another Heschel, in the sense that Heschel was someone who had both a deep rabbinic knowledge and a knowledge of Western philosophy. And that didn't work out that way. I know that they did sometimes see each other at the Jewish Theological Seminary. I know that Taubes sometimes said critical things about Heschel, but Taubes said critical things about almost everybody. Heschel's daughter, Susanna, who is quoted in the book, told me that when the JTS faculty tried not to talk about Taubes when the children were in earshot, but at some point she did hear that they referred to him as the Sitra Achra, that is someone who came from the realm of evil. So I think that was perhaps Heschel's ultimate view of Taubes, but I can't vouch for that.
And I guess we'll take this as the last one. Also JTS related. Mel Scott asks, Taubes appears in the diary of Mordechai Kaplan, who was a longtime member of the faculty at the seminary. Yes. It's perhaps more interesting about Richard Rubinstein than about Kaplan. The entry in November 27th, 1950 says, according to Rubinstein, Taubes seems to be not only a mystic, but a mysterious character. He describes Taubes as the kind of antinomian mystic who can find God in apostasy and immorality. What's your reaction?
Yes, so that was a reliable report from Richard Rubinstein to Mordechai Kaplan. And Richard Rubinstein wrote at length about Jakob Taubes in his own memoir, the title of which escapes me at the moment, but it's quoted at length in the book. And Taubes, Rubinstein was one of these people on whom Taubes exerted tremendous attraction and influence. Rubinstein came to JTS without a particularly good Jewish background, and Taubes tutored him in Talmud. At the time when Taubes was himself studying Talmud with Saul Lieberman. And in the process of that, though, he exposed Richard Rubenstein to his knowledge about Shabtai Tzvi and the idea of redemption through sin, and Elisha ben Abuya and the tradition of heresy in the Talmud and so on. And Rubenstein has a somewhat racy story in that memoir, which is in my book, and which I will leave it for readers to find. But yes, and Taubes, by the way, was the polar opposite of Mordechai Kaplan. I mean, Kaplan was largely a rationalist. He was a naturalist. He developed a sociological and anthropological conception of Judaism as a civilization, a very rich one to my mind. But it sort of reconciled Judaism to the modern world. And that was exactly what Taubes didn't like about him, and didn't like about that whole sort of naturalistic stream of Judaism. And so Taubes himself was very derogatory about Mordechai Kaplan. And one of the links between them that I discuss in the book was through Milton Steinberg, who had been a student and really disciple of Mordechai Kaplan. And he and Jakob Taubes cooperated for a while on the idea of doing a translation of Paul's epistles in the New Testament into Hebrew to see how Jewish it really was. That didn't work out for a number of reasons, but that's the Taubes-Kaplan connection, as it were.
Well, I can just recommend to everyone to read the book. Once you start it, you won't put it out of your hands. And that's actually different from how Taubes supposedly read books, because what Jerry Mueller says in the book is he rarely read a book from cover to cover. More typically, he would look at the cover, the table of contents, the index perhaps, and then leaf his way selectively through the book. After this procedure, which might take 10 or 15 minutes, he was prepared to evaluate the book's significance. Well, maybe Taubes could do that. But with this book, I would say you're well advised to read it from the first to the last page. And indeed, you want to do that. So thank you so much, Jerry, for joining us, giving us some insight into Taubes' life. But if you really want to know more, you have to look into the book. And thank you all for your questions. And I'll give it back to David.
I should just say thank you to Michael for conducting this conversation, and thank you to the Leo Baeck Institute, both for sponsoring this, but also for being there. As I've already indicated, it's an invaluable source for those of us who work on the history of German Jewry.
Thank you, Jerry, and thank you, Michael, both for that acknowledgement, Jerry, and for the erudite conversation. It was really interesting. And we'll be following up to everyone in the audience with a link to the video of this program and the discount code for the book. And I hope that you'll also think about joining us next week in the new year. On Thursday, September 29th, we'll have a discussion, similar format, with the author Ronen Steinke, a German journalist who wrote a book called Anna and Dr. Helmi, about an Egyptian doctor who saved a Jewish girl in Berlin. And it's also a wider history of the encounter between Jews and Muslims in Weimar, Germany. So that's next Thursday. We have more things coming up. And thank you all for joining us. Thanks to the Institute for Israel and Jewish Studies at Columbia. Jerry, Michael, thanks. Have a great afternoon, everyone.
Please like this video and subscribe for more content from the Leo Baeck Institute.